A man is but a product of his own thoughts. What he thinks, he becomes. These are the words of an extraordinary man whose birth anniversary we are commemorating today, the Mahatma Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. A very good morning to everyone. On behalf of the Gandhian Center for Philosophical Arts and Sciences, I welcome all of you to this special session organized on the occasion of Gandhi Jayanti. Joining us today as the chief guest is Dr. Chandan Gowda, a scholar, writer, and columnist at Deccan Herald. He has his PhD from the University of Michigan and is currently a professor at ICEC Bangalore. I welcome you to the session, sir.
Thank you.
Next, I would like to welcome our director, Professor Varadesh Hirakange, who ensures that the Gandhian Center always lives up to its name and remains the epitome of Gandhian values. Welcome to the session, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
I would like to warmly welcome all the esteemed guests, faculty members, research scholars, and students who are present here for this talk. Looking forward to a meaningful discussion on Gandhi, his writings, and his ideals. Let's begin the session through the melodious rendition of a bhajan that was close to the Mahatma's heart. I invite Shravya Basri to sing Vaishnava Janato, a song that emphasizes on the ideals and virtues that one must follow in life.
वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जी पीड़ पराई जाने रे वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जी पीड़ पराई जाने रे पर दुखे उपकार करे तो ये मन अभिमान ना हानि रे वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहे जी पीड़ पराई जाने रे समभावदले दुरासेयुनी गले वनितेगे अभयदानिरलिरली समभावदले दुरासेयुनी गले वनितेगे अभयदानिरलिरली ಸುಳ್ಳಿನ ರುಚಿಯನು ಅರಿಯದ ನಾಲಗೆ ಪರಧನವನ್ನು ಬೇಡಿನಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲರ ನೋವನು ಬಲ್ಲವನಾದರೆ ಗೆಲ್ಲುವೆ ನೀನು ಬಾಳಲ್ಲಿ ಲೋಭವಿಲ್ಲದ ಉಪಕಾರವೇ ಸುಖವು ಲೋಭವಿಲ್ಲದ ಉಪಕಾರವೇ ಸುಖವು ಗರ್ವವು ಬರದಿರೇ ಮಗದಲ್ಲಿ ವೈಷ್ಣವ ಜನ ತೋ ತೇನೆ ಕಹಿಜೆ ಪೀಡ ಪರಾಯಿ ಜಾಣೆ ರೇ वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जी पीड़ पराई जाने रे
Thank you, Shravya. I would like to invite Professor Varadesh for the introductory speech and to welcome everyone.
Good morning, everyone. In fact, whenever we listen to Vaishnava Janato in our own mother tongue, that makes a lot of difference. When it makes abundant sense, it appeals to us when we understand it clearly. And this is something Gandhiji also spoke about. So the need, the necessity for all the languages to grow. So it couldn't be just the dominance of one language, but all languages need to survive and grow. It's a special occasion for all of us, as I said. It is also a special occasion for the country, and it is also a special occasion for the whole world. I would put it that way. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, fondly called Bapuji, respectfully called Mahatma, was someone who spoke the language of Sarvodaya, welfare of all. And this Sarvodaya included not just his kinsmen and country, but literally and philosophically, everyone and everything, everyone and everything, literally everyone and everything. Man, women, marginalized of all castes, creeds, classes, religions, regions, countries and continents, nature and culture, nature and creature, flora and fauna, rivers and mountains, everything, everyone and everything. Perhaps that's why he could see that lively connection between the living and the non-living, between humans and nature. Hence, Gandhian comment, nature provides enough for everyone's need, not for everyone's greed. Hence, he could be rooted yet be universal. He could struggle for freedom of his own country, could also inspire millions across continents, cut across national barriers. He could be a living symbol of all non-violent struggles of all times against all kinds of oppression, all kinds of injustices, all kinds of inequalities, all kinds of violence, be it violence against humans or nature, women or marginalized, religions or nations. And Hind Swaraj is a little book with enormous significance, which captures certain elements of his core philosophical ideas in broad sense of the term. In tune with Gandhian cosmos and cosmology, we have MA in Ecosophical Aesthetics, MA in Art and Peace Studies, and BA in Aesthetics and Peace Studies this time. To talk about Hind Swaraj, we have with us today Professor Chandan Gowda. Chandan for many of us.
Thank you.
Yeah. A scholar, a writer, a columnist, someone who has thought about Gandhi and Hind Swaraj for quite some time, with his, of course, PhD in sociology from University of Michigan. He is someone who is quite conversant also with modern and postmodern theories, a multi-dimensional character, I must say, because he has also acted in a teleseries that was based on a very fine novel Bharatipura, authored by your well-known author, Professor U.R. Anantmurthy. Chandan is also closely associated with Professor Anantmurthy's literature, so also Purnachandra Tejasvi's literature. Of course, who has taught in Najim Premji University, who currently heads Ramakrishna Hegde Chair for Decentralization in Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bengaluru. This chair matters. What Chandan does there matters, because Institute of Social and Economic Change also has its heritage, and Ramakrishna Hegde, and decentralization, and rural development as a whole development, the whole notion of development that is being much discussed today. What could be the nature of development? So Chandan is here with us. Incidentally, he also writes a column in Deccan Herald, so you may read him once in 15 days perhaps. And someone who also recently wrote about Gopal Krishna Gandhi's Restless as Mercury, about Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Restless as Mercury, that is the title. And I must say, intellectually, Chandan himself is as restless as Mercury.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm so happy that Chandan is with us to talk to us on Hind Swaraj. I wholeheartedly welcome you, Chandan, Professor Chandan Gowda. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Vardesh, for that warm.
Yeah. And of course, I also welcome, of course, all others, our guests who have joined, and all the students, our former students, and the journalists, all those who have joined. So I welcome, and over to Chandan. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Vardesh, for that warm and affectionate introduction. I'm thankful to your center for inviting me to give a talk on a book that I find exciting each time I read it. And when you invited me to give a talk at your center this morning, I just felt I could do nothing better than share my own sense of excitement about the book and why the book has appealed to me for so long. So thank you. Those of you who have not seen this little book, as Professor Vardesh Hiregange called it, but which appears as a fairly sizable book in the mid-90s with Anthony Parell's introduction and edited annotations. Cambridge has published that edition. And since there's been another edition, the Trudip Sahrud and Suresh Sharma have prepared, looking at the Gujarati original and having more commentaries to offer on the text. Hind Swaraj was written in 1909 in over 10 days while Gandhi was returning from England to South Africa, written in Gujarati, and Gandhi translated it to English soon after the British banned it in India. And this is the only book of his that he has himself translated. And he was attached to this book in ways that he was not to other writings of his. And Gandhi scholars tell us reluctant to change anything in this book, except for a few words. The essential ideas remain the same, is what he continued to say. Why did Gandhi feel the need to write the book? 1909, Indian nationalist movement has evolved to a degree, and Dadabhai Navroji and Rana Dey and the others in the Congress party who are basically demanding for a transfer of power gradually. And they're fine with the Indian state that the British have assembled, and they want a transfer of power, either gradually or quickly. But the demand is that political power be vested in the hands of Indians themselves. And in this book, Gandhi actually expresses enormous gratitude to Navroji for preparing the soil on which a critique of this kind that he has evolved can be made. Because it's one of the amazing, unmissable things in Gandhi's writing. He rarely does he denounce people. And even when he points out mistakes in them, the very next minute he jumps to their rescue, defense, as it were, and says that should not be held against them. So that was the context. Then he's trying to say, well, freedom is something more, much, much more, probably something other than political power. That is the immediate context to this book. And he's also very, very concerned about showing that violent means ought not to be employed in this enterprise of seeking Swaraj, something that violence held fascination for a small section of Indian freedom fighters at that time. And our own interest in the book, there is a crisis in modern civilization, continues. The crisis continues. I mean, I think it was seen to be in crisis 100 years ago. It continues to be seen in crisis even now, and our concerns have changed, shifted. There's a crisis in our parliamentary democracy here, as well as in Western democracies themselves are under a crisis. And just when commentators had declared that history had ended, that liberal democracy was the only model available for people to arrange their political life, realized that that model had come unstuck, and there's a desperate search for alternate visions of organizing military life, political life. That, and the interest in American academic scholarship on Gandhi, which you saw in the last 10-15 years, is completely driven by the need to critique liberalism as the only available political philosophy for organizing polities. But in India before then, we have people like Ashish Nandi and others who had a different sense for why Hind Swaraj mattered. I mean, they were trying to say that Western modernity itself had to be questioned, a somewhat different skepticism there. But be that as it may, that is the context why a book like this, which actually got dropped after independence. Nobody read Hind Swaraj after independence. Lohia talks about it in Economics After Marx, but really someone like Naipaul, who doesn't understand the book, who actually says it's full of anti-modern whimsicalities, I think, he observes that there is no one reads this book in India. So, the Gandhi scholars like Biko Parekh and Raghavan are, foreground the importance in the 70s, but the book itself doesn't quite acquire the kind of presence it has today, where, it's got a wider readership and a curiosity about what this book is. One thing that will become evident straight away when you see this book, I mean, it is trying to set aside a fixation with modern civilization, but it's doing so in a very soft manner. It's a very gentle critique. It is very tentative. Even after Gandhi offers his definition of civilization, he says, if this be accepted as correct, and then goes on to say other things. It is non-imperialistic and it's enormously patient. Contrary to the phrase restless as Mercury, which is what Gandhi's sister termed him when they were children, there's no restlessness anywhere in this book, which is structured like a dialogue, I forgot to mention, between an editor of a newspaper and a reader, a very modern setting, because newspaper is a modern day institution. And Anthony Parel, the editor of Hind Swaraj, very usefully reminds us, please note that it's not Guru Shishya, that's not the model he is putting in front, but he's very clear that we are living in a modern world. Okay, so what does Gandhi do? I mean, Gandhi does many things in the book, more things than we have time for in today's lecture. And I urge those of you who have not seen it yet to do so, because you could just look at for his style, for his literary style, for his extraordinary sort of sense of humor, and how he uses almost the traditional method of using analogies from everyday life to prove a point, all the time, all through the text. And also his own, the intellectual universe he inhabited, which is not exclusivist at all. It includes many, many Indian texts, but it includes a lot of texts from outside, notably the Bible, the Quran, and at least the references are there. Muhammad is there, and then Ruskin, Tolstoy, we know the names. And Gandhi actually, again, he's aware that he's done something important. In the Gujarati edition, I believe he says, I've discovered something original, and which is not retained in the introduction to the English edition, where he says, the views here are mine, but not mine. They're mine because I plan to live by them, but they're not mine in the sense they're shared by a lot of people, and many people before me have said these things. And I've always taken this claim fairly literally to mean he's actually arrived at these observations, which you could call observations in philosophical anthropology, of what is the man here, made up of in moral terms, and the vision of the human that he wants to offer as something embodying true civilization, conforms to what it appears to me to have emerged from his own observations of people around him during his, the years he spent here. Okay, so one of the key things he does, the writer is Gandhi, we have to presume that to be the case, is to demystify the attractions of modern civilization, because he sees modern Indians, the ambivalence, as we all know, the ambivalence towards colonial rule and what it did to this country continues to persist. They cheated us, they exploited us, but didn't they give us good things? And what are the good things? Universal education, rule of law, private property. You can draw up a list. So Gandhi, one of the things he does in this book is to tell you how each of the things that the British have claimed to be important and necessary and something that they have and that we do not have is something that is not to be, absorbed at face value. You have to look at it critically. So what you have across many chapters is Gandhi showing why doctors and lawyers are exploitative and life is better off without them, why railways can actually bring about artificial famines and cause widespread misery, and in traveling at great speeds, actually can destroy the purpose ingrained in an act of pilgrimage, which actually requires you to walk long distances, and the walking itself is part of the pilgrimage, etc., etc. There's a lot there. But what is the key defining thrust of modern civilization? He says it makes bodily welfare the object of life. And then he goes on to say, the homes we are supposed to live in now are supposed to be more comfortable, the clothes are more comfortable, the weapons are quicker at annihilation and destroying more, all of that. And he says, can this be seen as progress? Can this be seen as good things? And he goes on to disabuse the reader of any illusions he may have had about why these things are, wrong, why these things are important to have in modern India. So I think this is not exactly only of historical relevance. I think the attractions of modernity, Western modernity, now a little more spread out, in the sense China can be part of this, the Dubai, the buildings there can seem like things to have here. But Gandhi is saying, no, we cannot have these for their own sake. We knew why these things are bad. So, and a very important thing that Gandhi does throughout the book is to invoke the presence of ancestors. Our ancestors knew that if a plow did the job well, there was no need for innovation. They knew why should we have large cities? When we know that such large dwellings are conducive for generation of voice, etc., etc. So, we can discuss separately, how Gandhi uses the past as an important source for making an argument in the present, and how accurate that was, whether it was necessary for that past to be accurate, etc. So he sets aside the notion of progress. If the West had showed material objects like buildings, like steam engines, like modern instruments of production to show that it had progressed and others were backward, Gandhi completely rejects the use of material symbolic evidence to sort out civilizations as progressive and backward. And that's an extraordinary defiance. If you think about it, almost 100 years of Indians before him hadn't bothered to put the West on trial. They were willing to admit that you have a lot to teach us, but do teach us. Raja Mohan Roy famously. Now, there's a chapter on what is true civilization, which is where Gandhi will tell us that true civilization is that points to man the path of duty, dharma. And here the shift is entirely on man, the individual human being, who has to attain mastery over his mind and passions, and who has to exercise bodily restraint over his passions. And this vision of the moral man, who is a human? A human is someone who is capable of exercising an inwardness and exercising restraint over his passions. And a true civilization is something that will tell them how to go about this. And in this substitution of the idea of the human from that of the human of the economics discipline that said we're here, our life is short, our wants are infinite, resources are finite, and how do we make, create a balance between our want seeking and resource availability. This is modern economics. So Gandhi, again, like Ruskin, who had rejected that style of thinking about humans and the world, is putting an alternate human at the center, someone who is a moral being and who ought to be capable of self-sacrifice. The idea of self-sacrifice is very, very important. And in his discussion of passive resistance later in the book, he will say that there are millions and millions of acts of passive resistance, self-sacrifice, without which the world cannot proceed, but which modern historical scholarship does not pay any attention to, because it doesn't see how soul force or love force or truth force, all these equivalents for satyagraha. But I'm getting ahead of what I wanted to say. So if you just think about his definition, he's not interested in the external world of objects. He's completely looking inside and saying that observance of duty is where you can see the workings of civilization. And it is a non-elitist understanding, in the sense that in this vision, every human is capable of exercising, this moral self-inwardness. So there isn't a scheme for some people to tutor the others in how to do this. Gandhi is completely convinced that everyone is capable of arriving at his or her own dharma. There's no need for mediation from institutions. I'll come to this again later. Once he has this reversal in place, and please remember, words like dharma seem clearly from the register of Indian social moral universe, but this discussion nowhere restricts itself as being relevant to India alone. I mean, it's an enormous capacity of this discussion to seem like something that everyone can join in. And indeed, nowhere is Gandhi looking at the modern West and saying that none of you are incapable of understanding what is this. In fact, many of you have felt like this amongst yourselves. And when it's an individualist orientation like this, one of the things that happens is there's no conformity to group authority. You really, you are left to your own conscience to figure out how to interact with the world and the others around you. Okay, now this is by way of a bare bone excavation of central things in this book, but a few things, we have, the talk is titled Hind, Swaraj in Our Times. If what the contemporaries of the political predicament, pushes you to foreground a few things here as, what is of importance here? How does it help me engage my own present? And like I said, there are many ways in which it can help you. A few things that I felt like sharing with you today. If none of us here can be in any doubt about how the idea of the Indian nation is one of the most charged debates in our public life. And this is not a new predicament. I mean, we've had discussion about who belongs to the Indian nation, for many, many decades, including the time in which Gandhi lived. So for Gandhi, the fundamental social tension that he's had to respond to in the country is the question of Hindu-Muslim unity. And I may as well say at this moment that at that point, either the question of untouchability, when I say at that point, I mean at the point at which he's writing Hind Swaraj, untouchability is not on the radar, nor are tribals anywhere present in this discussion. I mean, they appear later. Of course, in his autobiography, 10 years down the line, untouchability appears to be a very big problem among his own concerns. So, and how does Gandhi address the question of the presence of multiple religions in relation to how we think of the nation? So Gandhi's word for the nation is praja. And he says, if Jainism and Vedic religion are considered separate dharmas, it's absurd to call them different nations. Similarly, you can't see Muslims as belonging to another nation. They're all part of the Indian praja. And he sees, Indians as being a family. He doesn't use the word family, but the examples he gives to tell us why tensions between these communities need not seem unnatural. He says, don't brothers often fight? And this is an extraordinary way in which he uses examples from ordinary life to illustrate larger moral ways of coming to terms, reconciliation being a key requirement there. And Gandhi, he will try to talk like our historians do. He will say, well, didn't Shaivites and Vaishnavites also fight? So it's not as if the fight is only between Hindus and Muslims. Many dharmas have fought with each other, but we also know that Hindus prospered under Muslim rulers, and Muslims prospered under Hindu rulers. This is a way in which our historians try to rebut the claims that it was one simple story of, one community not relating properly to another community. Gandhi will reject that on historical grounds, but he also has this ethical means of asking us to see the falseness of the problem. Brothers always fight, often fight. This is, Ashish Nandi has made this into a huge argument. He's saying, even like here, he says, like panchayats, I've always felt, or even in families where there are disputes, the concern is getting on and living amicably in the time to come. So when that is the prime consideration, finger pointing at who did what when first, didn't he do that first, didn't she do that first, is of not much consequence, is unhelpful, in fact, for was reconciliation. So there's a strategic forgetting, if you will, in the interest of living together wisely in the end. And Nandi's point is that Gandhi keeps this understanding open to how he looks at the past. He does not feel to think like a historian with facts all the time. And one of the things, so what does Gandhi think has happened? He uses the word samasa, which we have in grammar. When two words are conjoined, a new word emerges with new energies. That's what happens when different communities live together. So this is a very different model of intercommunity life than, say, like the multicultural one, which says you can hold on to your differences but tolerate each other. Here, you're asking them to come together. And then there's no anxiety about the coming together, meaning someone will be shortchanged and someone will gain unfairly. The idea is that there is gain for all. It's a metaphorical illustration of gain from communities living each other. In a book that I would urge you to read along with this book, it's a short book called Reconstructive Program. Constructive Program, its meaning and place, written in 1942, where you have a concrete program like suggestions about what to do. And he's addressing the congressman. He says all congressmen must inhabit all religions in themselves. So, this is, he says in some part, if part of Hind Swaraj, if Hindus bother to read the Quran and if Muslims read Bhagavad Gita, they will find many parts acceptable and agreeable. And behind that invitation to read each other's texts is the presumption that there is a kind of isolation, which actually is breeding ground for mutual suspicion. So how the overcoming distrust and arriving at trust and goodwill happens through engagement. And another way in which he says we can engage the other is by making friendships. So he urges congressmen in 1942 to make sure that they have friends from all faiths. And I feel, this exhortation, advice continues to be relevant. Make friends with people outside your own community. So Gandhi constantly relies on communities, individuals, overcoming things on their own without the mediation of courts, without the mediation of law, without the mediation of the state, which is why there is such an uninterest in discussing the state per se. One of the big omissions in Hind Swaraj is there's no interest in how the Indian state has to be designed once the British leave. It's as if once you have a decentralized order, a state appropriate to it will emerge. And I think this point must have meant a lot of confusion, because in the mid-30s, Gandhi does say that, what I've said in Hind Swaraj is India is not ripe for it right now. Of course, now we want a parliamentary system after the British go, but in time we'll realize the futility of these institutions. See, the other very important thing about Hind Swaraj is you could actually, if you want to characterize it, you could also characterize Hind Swaraj as a discussion about how to be an anti-fascist, or how to keep fascism out of this world. And if by fascism we understand an uncritical, enthusiastic, even crazed fascination for the state, an over-centralized state, and you give up individual freedoms and expect the state to engineer society for you in the way you think it's good. So there, the individual is setting himself or herself aside. You subordinate yourself to the authority of this thing called the state and allow it to suppress freedoms, both of yourself and the others. In Gandhi, it's the opposite. The individual, the Swaraj has to be achieved at the individual level. And there is no particular faith that he puts in some macro institution called the state to set right things. Setting right has to happen by individuals setting right their own passions. And again, he has got this fascination example to pull out from the past. He will say, look, kings never had a status as high as that of rishis and fakirs. And this is his way of saying that in our country, civilization, temporal power, the pursuit of temporal power has not been given primary importance in the scheme of values. It is renunciation, it is giving up, it is self-sacrifice. These are the acts that have been seen as important. By doing this and saying that this is important for all of us to recognize and live with and live by is a guarantee against the emergence of attractions towards fascism. And and I think the importance of this discussion cannot be overstated, not just in this country, but in many other countries of the world, where you see a strange kind of acceptance of illiberal political action by political leaders. The one other thing that I have found useful, both as an academic and also as someone who wants to think of himself as not only an academic in thinking of problems and how to manage them, the reader in Hind Swaraj will confront the editor, saying that, look, you've been saying that this country is wonderful in all these ways, but what about all these problems of child marriage and sati and the Devadasi system, and what about these things? How do you accept these? Gandhi's response, of course, is to say that these are not features of the civilization, they're problems present. And by the way, communities have known that they were not good things on their own. But if you like, you could utilize the modern spirit. There's only a place where he makes an admission to why an external sort of value system, that is something that modern liberal philosophy may have spawned, could be useful in judging why a social practice is a bad thing. But so in this manner, what you're doing is not to vilify all of tradition as a terrible thing. You do admit to the fact that there are terrible things, but then you also say that it can't be that tradition wasn't uncomfortable about it itself, and let's look for when that might be. Well, if you don't find any evidence to that, then let's make use of what we have in front of us to launch our criticisms of why something has to be stopped. And this is a very, very open-ended relationship with tradition, where you allow yourself to be open to someone pointing out a problem and you finding that indeed it's a problem and we need to now have abandon certain aspects of tradition. So there isn't a total embrace. Tradition is not being seen as in a total way, in a frozen manner, which has to be somehow embraced regardless of anything. So it's an ongoing open relationship with it. This is important because when you notice a problem, you actually, instead of taking the vantage point of law and saying that, I see a problem, let's change it, you allow the community to discover voices of disapproval from within. Had it been approved really by everyone? Maybe those voices were suppressed, because that's a surer guarantee of getting the community to accept why it's a problem and why they may want to reform those practices, as opposed to a body of law that speaks the language of rights, universal rights, and then points out to the various, abhorrent practices inside. So very, very, I think, delicate, subtle move where you also allow yourself to relate to tradition in a almost like an artist, where you're not, I'm not a scientist who has only facts to work with and no freedom to work outside facts. Here you have a whole new creative room to work with, community memories. Another thing that, the emphasis that Gandhi laid on passive resistance, where he's got many definitions of passive resistance. One of which is, by through suffering you acquire rights. For those of you who may wonder, it's all fine to talk about duties, but where are rights? It's as if by the performance of one's duty, one goes on to acquire rights. By suffering, by insisting on that others see the truth of your experience, that you acquire the rights of demanding others relate to you in a certain way. So rights become a corollary of duties and personal suffering. So, and Gandhi was again, one of the things that this book does, and outside of anything else, he will keep revising your conceptions of the Indian past, almost like something that the historians ought to be doing themselves. One example, he says, I have known, peasants in a village, if they disapproved of what the king did, they would refuse to comply in paying a tax, and they would assemble and tell the king that something was wrong, and then the king would have to listen to them and change something that they didn't like. And this is again a new thing, in the sense you always see history almost in static terms as contributions towards literature, music, whatever, or wars, but rarely do you have a sense for what do people do when they disapprove of kings. The king's completely sovereign the whole time, and no one can question them. And the Gandhian historian Dharampal has actually been inspired by this insight of Gandhi, done an excavation of an episode of protest in Banaras, actually, when the house tax was increased by the British, and large numbers of people collected to say that they didn't approve what the British did, and the British had no other way of understanding it except in terms of sedition. They felt this was disloyalty, whereas a king would have understood it instantly. And I mention all of this to say that we've had the biggest dharna that Indian history has probably ever seen. It's been almost a year since the farmers have been sitting outside Delhi to protest what is seen as the farm laws, and there's not a hint of recognition of the importance of having to engage them in a conversation by the political authorities. But we just see the enormity of the appeal of, let's not say Gandhi is the initiator of Dharna. Of course, he gave it extraordinary life in his own time to a past practice, but which continues in our midst in this fashion. And this is a way of also confronting the real politic world in which we all live, where the protest can be misrepresented as being funded by anti-nationals or being funded by vested interest middlemen who stand to gain from having this farm law scrapped, etc., etc. But the fact remains that it's an extraordinarily living testimony to a form of non-violent protest against political power. So it's an ongoing thing in front of our very own eyes. The last thing I would like to say is that the text has all the answers to all the difficult questions of our time. I mean, there are serious political conflicts in the world, and it's not just now. I mean, people have raised this question in the past. What ought the Jews ought to have done in Nazi Germany, etc. So and those are difficult situations where there are no, you can't have a textbook like affirmations of non-violence categorically. But the Gandhian vision does offer you an extraordinary sense of the problem and how variously it can be engaged given where you are, and without being impatient to see a response in you straight away. I mean, it is nothing if not patient, and then the sense of time involved here in terms of when can something expect to have found fulfillment as a political demand is hard to decide. It's an ongoing thing, but so there's no speed here, and there's no mobs here. There's no sense of an organized mobilization, taking over the state, etc. These images of protest are not what you find here. And we know that Gandhi himself did organize a very large protest in the non-cooperation movement, and then the Chauri Chaura incident, and he had to halt it. But then one of the realizations he had was precisely how self-satisfying it can be just to organize a big mob as a show of strength, and he just wasn't happy about that form of political opposition expressing itself in public. But be that as it may, there's a very rich discussion on education in Indian languages, and Vardesh actually began by alerting us to how the same bhajan can sound so closer and can evoke emotions that the Gujarati cannot if it's done in Kannada. That I think is that Gandhi himself would have loved to have heard that, I think, because it is important to have a model of education that takes local languages seriously. I mean, it's amazing that we're even having to say it. And things have reached such a point that we actually have to frame it, a response in this fashion. Gandhi, has a fondness for Hindi as a national language, which I find bizarre, considering his other openness on the question of what we ought to be as a community. But yeah, there are problems of this kind, which I think in the spirit of Gandhianness, I think we have to have an open relationship with this text, not see it as set in stone. I should stop here, Pradesh.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Chandan. Just simply excellent. And in fact, we have heard a different language, because generally we are conversant with one kind of language that is primarily used to talk about Gandhiji. But we should also remember that there has been a large body of scholarship consistently worked on Gandhian writings, Gandhian literature, and we shouldn't be just carried away by what gets circulated on WhatsApp and other social media. So there is a need certainly to engage with Gandhi in a more serious manner, and I think Chandan has spoken that language of scholarship on Gandhi.